lyden på? Yeah. Thank you. You people in the back, can you please come in, join us, and close the door? This hour we have called How to Investigate Corruption in the Arms Trade. It happens that we as journalists want to work on this secretive trade sector, and it's a heavily politicized trade, and it's difficult to work with. Everyone who is trying to get out public documents on this sector is facing a number of problems. To join us, we have three very competent people to talk about this. The last speaker I will introduce first is Kristoffer Egeberg from Dagbladet. Please rise. He will speak about his exposure of how Norwegian warships ended up with a Nigerian warlord quite recently, and he's been doing a lot of follow-ups also on that story. He won the SKUP award this year for this exposure. Two South African citizens living in London are with us, Andrew Feinstein and Paul Holden. Mr. Feinstein, he was a Member of Parliament for almost 2 terms in South Africa for the ANC, and he resigned from Parliament, or was forced out, that's a long discussion, after a big conflict around how the Parliament was to deal with a big corruption scheme in South African arms deal, which has now been a trauma in South African politics for 15 years. These two gentlemen now live in London and work at the organization Corruption Watch, and that's one of the places where journalists can turn to when they need help exposing these kind of stories. So we're going to see a little bit from their work. This is an NGO, but they are using many of the same research means and some of the publication platforms that we will do also, including books and documentary film. So thank you, give them a warm hand, and there will be time for questions in between and after.
Thank you very much for that introduction and for having us here. As was said, we're not journalists in the conventional sense. We write in the media for a wide variety of newspapers, websites, but not on a constant or regular basis. We produce reports on specific cases. Paul and I, between us, have written 3 books on the South African deal that was mentioned, and our sort of magnus opus on the arms trade is a book called The Shadow World Inside the Global Arms Trade that came out in 2011 in its first edition. It's in its 9th edition now, with a Japanese edition having come out a few months ago. A full-length documentary feature has been made of that book, which will be released in January of 2016. And we thought that what might be a good idea is to start the session off by just showing a very short trailer from that film, which will give you some sense of the sort of multiple platforms we do our work on, and also of our approach to the trade.
Well, we've undergone a corporate coup d'etat in slow motion, to quote John Holstensaw, and it's over, they've won. And what they have done is shut out all the astute critics of corporate power.
The thing about politicians is that they're very much like prostitutes, but only more expensive. The politics is dictated by the whims of the arms industry. Politicians are nothing more than sales reps, my dear friend. At the end of the day, they do what they're told. And when they don't, well...
Not only will we take you down preemptively, we'll take you down preventively. If we think that you might present a threat sometime in the future, we're going to annihilate you. We're going to come take you on. We're going to get you.
I got a phone call from the FBI saying that I was a target of a death threat. And that's what happens when you go against the big boys. Then I came up close with that shadow world where what is, isn't.
Fiscal year 1999, 2.3 trillion missing. Fiscal year 2000, 1.1 trillion missing. The Pentagon has claimed year after year that the reason it can't account for the money is because its computers don't communicate with each other.
I was called in by a senior member of the ANC's National Executive Council. He said to me, look, Andrew, this is a battle you cannot win because this money, the bribes, were used to fund our 1999 election. And almost immediately, I'm asked to make a statement to the press that says there's nothing to investigate. So it's all over. And I looked at him and I said, no, it's not.
I would be offended if I thought we had a monopoly on corruption.
Were you aware that your government was approving payments to a friend of President Bush's as part of British Aerospace's kickback system? Is that why you suspended a fraud inquiry?
The heads of government are the salespeople in chief of their country's large arms contractors.
We are not in the business of passing, as you suggest, large sums of money to employees of government. I mean, it is just not the way business is done.
Corruption is not merely a dirty little detail on top of the arms trade. It's actually, in a lot of cases, what drives the international arms trade.
JP Morgan paid him off for the Iraq war. He held up the Iraq bank for $20 billion. He was paid $6 million every year. The man is a war criminal.
Can I just say, actually, on the record, what he said about Iraq and JP Morgan is completely and totally untrue.
I went through the Pentagon in 2001, and one of the generals said, sir, I got this memo on my desk. We're going to go after 7 countries in 5 years.
We're going to start with Iraq, and then we're going to move to Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran.
Eventually, stories appear. So today, it's acceptable for me to talk about the way the Afghan war in the late 70s and early 80s was financed and built up by a combination of Saudi, Pakistani, American financing and logistical support.
Another US arms deal with Saudi Arabia is in the pipeline, the biggest in history.
There must be something wrong with the way we think, that we can't say that the grammar of the past is operating today.
Last night, on my orders, America's armed forces began strikes against ISIL targets in Syria.
Just ahead of airstrikes in Syria, defense firms Lockheed Martin, Northrop, Raytheon, and General Dynamics Corporation all set stock price records. Their shareholders are making money off the unusually large number of conflicts around the world.
Weapons are about trade. They're not about defense. They're not about winning even. The moment a gun crosses a frontier, it's a currency note. People think the whole of the Middle East is going to become Islamist. It's going to be Egyptistan, Syriastan. What we're going to have is Mafiastan. Any weapon that moves into a war zone is a financial commodity.
As we look out 3, 5, 7, 10 years, this market remains very much a growth market.
There's no hope of ending war because there's always a small cabal of people for whom war is really, really good business. I'll tell you the most effective way to curb war, and that's stop selling arms.
Right. Thank you. So, the trade in weapons is a completely unique economic sector, not only because of the consequences of the trade, but as much because of the fact that this is an industry that, according to work done by Transparency International, accounts for around 40% of all corruption in all world trade. When the US Department of Commerce did a study over 5 years of corrupt transactions involving American companies, just over 50% of those transactions were in the defense sector. But as importantly, related to that is the fact that everything that happens in this trade takes place behind a veil of national security imposed secrecy. So when we came out with this book in 2011, the previous book on the global arms trade had been written in 1979 by a brilliant British writer called Anthony Sampson. Publishers are terrified of very litigious defense companies and of the fact that so much is closed down as a consequence of national security. And what is crucial for us as investigators and journalists to bear in mind, that what lies at the heart of the trade are relationships between the weapons producers, governments, the military, intelligence agents, international arms dealers, because the extraordinary thing is the arms dealers that we track around the world involved in the so-called illicit trade are exactly the same people who are used by the world's major defense contractors and their governments to secure deals such as the South African deal that I try to investigate in South Africa. So the boundaries between the legal and illicit arms industries are extremely fuzzy. And we would argue that they're very closely intertwined. And central to those relationships, and sometimes overlooked but very important, is the fact that those involved in the trade, be it the manufacturers or the intermediaries, have extremely close relationships with individual senior politicians and with political parties. So on the Al Yamama deal, a deal in which £6 billion of bribes were paid, according to the Metropolitan Police in London. Over £1 billion to Prince Bandar bin Sultan, who at the time was the Saudi ambassador to the US, and happened coincidentally to be the son of Saudi's defense minister at the time. And just in case the billion wasn't enough, BAE also gave him, as a gift, an Airbus, painted in the colors of his favorite American football team, the Dallas Cowboys. Tony Blair, in his last months in office, closed down a 5.5-year investigation by the UK's Serious Fraud Office into that transaction. In the case of the South African deal that I try to investigate first from the inside as a Member of Parliament, I was the ranking ANC member on the main Financial Oversight Committee. And what that did was it gave me access very briefly to confidential cabinet documents and to a variety of contractual documents. They were given to me and the chair of the committee by the Speaker of Parliament, who 48 hours later was instructed to get every document back from us. So we had sort of 2 hours notice in which we photocopied as many of the documents as we could before they took them back. But it gave me a unique insight of an arms deal from the side of government, from the inside. Once I'd been forced out of Parliament because I was told to stop the investigation by the top leadership of my political party and refused, then the challenge became, how do I prove those same things, but now from the outside? And because of this veil of national security, it is extremely difficult. It's just worth mentioning that today, South Africa's current president, Jacob Zuma, faced 783 counts of fraud, corruption, and racketeering in relation to that particular deal. The charges were dropped a few weeks before he was elected president by an acting prosecutor who a few weeks after the election was made an acting high court judge. And I tell you this just to give you an indication of the sorts of obstacles that you confront in trying to address this trade. So we've been fortunate in that we've developed, not really through our own doing, a network of people working globally on the arms trade. People within defense companies, a lot of prosecutors, obviously investigative journalists, people who have come across information for a variety of strange reasons, because they don't have a lot of people to go to. So the first thing I would say that as journalists working in this area, like Kristoffer, who's done phenomenal work in Norway, I think it's important to develop almost a specialization and a prominence in the area so people know who to go to if they have information on this issue. The second thing I want to say is that because we don't have daily, weekly, monthly, or even annual publishing deadlines, an enormous amount of our work is to collaborate with journalists, media organizations, websites, and other investigators and prosecutors working on these cases. So please, if you are working on these cases and we could be of any assistance, we'd love to hear from you. Paul is going to go through some of the tools that we use to get below this, this veil of national security imposed secrecy. One thing I would like to say, though, in the book and in our work generally, we do speak to quite a lot of arms dealers, but probably only about 95% of all of those we approach. And perhaps our greatest coup in those terms was for the book. We saw the name of an arms dealer who was described by an arms industry executive as the scariest human being he'd ever met, which of course fascinated us, and we wanted to meet this guy. And we tried for months and months and months to find him and couldn't, and eventually, embarrassingly, found him on Facebook. The 77-year-old Beirut-based arms dealer had a Facebook page to communicate with his grandchildren because he traveled so much. And when we wrote to him, his initial response was effectively, in my long life, I've done nothing. I've never done anything for nothing. Why should I start now? And clearly, neither ethically nor financially were we in a position to offer him anything. And the way we got to speak to him was, for about 18 months, I would email him fortnightly, telling him that this one I'd met and that one I'd met had told me that we can't write a book on the global arms trade unless we've spoken to him, because he knows more about it than anybody else alive. And eventually, flattery and ego did the trick. And when we have been successful, largely, that has been the basis of gaining that access in this particular industry. But of course, there are a great many other tools and techniques that we use that Paul's going to take you through.
Right, so as Andrew described, I'm going to take you through a very quick tour of some of the things that we use when we do our work. I just want to point out before I begin that this is really geared towards, I suppose, what you'd call the formal trade, or sort of the bigger ticket items, although we do deal with some arms trafficking stuff. I do address some arms trafficking stuff right at the end to give you some tools and tricks to track different deals that are being done. So what we'll cover today very quickly in this 15 minutes is just how to monitor the formal trade, how corruption generally tends to happen, what we tend to look for, what we see as our warning signs, what online tools we use, what particular sort of networks we create to do the work, how to find and manage sources, and then also how to find and approach different arms dealers. Normally when I do this training, we have a long segment beforehand on security protocols, which unfortunately I can't do now. But I'm assuming that as journalists, most of you will know that stuff already. But I have to emphasize once again, this is quite a sensitive field, and using some very basic security protocols like email encryption, encrypting your chats. We use various different encryption tools in our phones to chat about sensitive stuff is a really good idea in this field. Right. So this is the list of all the sort of main formal databases that we use for the trade. And we will be putting up a cheat sheet a bit later, so people can get an access to this list of databases. Probably the most important one, and the one we turn to the most often, is the SIPRI Arms Transfer Database. That's the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute arms transfer database. And what they do is they track every arms transaction that's above the level of a military vehicle and upwards. So that doesn't include small and light weapons. What's very useful about them is that they don't just base their work on formal disclosures. They also base it on information they've gotten in the public domain. and they try to value that information. So they try to give you a sense of how much in terms of value is being imported and exported across different countries. If you want to look at the small arms trade, a really great place to start is the PRIO Small Arms database. PRIO is based here in Norway. And essentially what they've done is that they've made a much more simplistic way of engaging with UN data. What you might not know is that every single country in the world who's a signatory to the UN Comtrade database, which is, I think, 192 countries, has to submit trade information about what they've imported and what they've exported. And that includes small and light weapons and various other categories as well, including non-lethal ammunition. The UN Comtrade database is incredibly complicated to use. I hate using it. But PRIO is fantastic for just giving you a great user interface to sort of get into that stuff. I'd also like to point out that there are a lot of regional initiatives around small and light arms, and also the bigger trade doing monitoring and tracking. The one that seems to be the most effective is called CSAC, which is for the Balkans and Eastern Europe. Now that's quite interesting for people who are looking into arms exports, particularly into Africa. We've seen that quite a lot of the illicit trade is now happening through a number of countries, in particular Montenegro, and they are forced to declare their trade data through CSAC. Then there's the Small Arms Survey. They help both with sort of tracking trends in the trade, but also how to identify stuff. And then almost every single country will have a parliamentary report that's published giving a summary of their exports. Now, unfortunately, the level of disclosure is usually pretty poor, but at least you can pick out some trends. Some countries are better than others, obviously. South Africa, for example, is a tale and how these things go from good to bad. They used to publish very detailed descriptions of the licenses that they would be issuing every year to various different companies. The most recent one literally just gave a headline figure and 3 or 4 countries that they say are their biggest customers. But they're useful to look to anyway. Right, so what we look for when we're looking for corruption, when we're looking at the procurement process in particular, and fund flows, those are the 2 things that we focus on. And I think you probably, as journalists, will know this was originally developed for people who had no journalistic experience whatsoever. But almost every single case that we've looked at that involved grant corruption involved some form of illicit fund flows to an offshore jurisdiction, BVI, increasingly Mauritius in the African case. And in the another big area that we're worried about, which I'll speak in a bit more detail, is the use of offsets. I don't know how many people here know about offsets and how they run. Essentially, what offsets are, I'm going to go through that now, is when defense companies are obliged to invest in the buying country's economy. Usually that involves, moving a production stream to another country, but often it involves literally just investing in, say, a condom factory, as what happened in South Africa, or investing in a tourist destination. And the idea behind that is it's supposed to offset the cost of buying arms to the purchasing country. Now, this is a relatively new area for people to investigate, but offsets now are absolutely enormous in the defense sector and the formal trade. They seem a bit wonkish, but they're going to become incredibly important over the next 10 years. Currently, there are $450 billion worth of offset obligations in the defense and aerospace sector alone. And those are supposed to be fulfilled in the next 10 years. So there's going to be $450 billion worth of some sort of investment in trade linked to these particular arms deals. Now, they're incredibly dangerous from a corruption point of view. First of all, they're almost always secret. They're veiled under this commercial confidentiality. So getting hold of the list of companies that are being invested in is quite difficult. Second of all, sort of reflecting the broader trade, offsets in the defense sector don't fall under WTO rules. The use of offsets in contracting is actually banned by the WTO. You can't use offsets as a procurement criteria, except when it comes to defense contracts. And in fact, the entire WTO government-to-government procurement article, I think it's Article 12, does not apply to the defense sector. Now, what we've seen is that it works in a very simple way. Either there's a bribe to be paid and you have a fake company and you sort of slide it into an offset contract and that's how you pay people. Or a more sophisticated method is that if a politician knows that a particular offset contract is going to happen, they will be given a slice of that company to benefit from the investment down the line. So some of the big examples we picked up recently is Embraer in the Dominican Republic. What happened there was that they tried to pay a bribe directly to, Embraer officials tried to pay a bribe directly to the Dominican Republic Air Force employees, and the compliance department stopped it. So what they did instead was they set up a fake offset contract via Dubai, and they did that very easily because the compliance department didn't bother checking the offsets investments because they're expecting money to be going out. Finmeccanica in India, I don't know if people have been following, that's become quite a big scandal in India around the very, very important person's helicopters. And what happened there, which is pretty galling, they essentially set up a transfer pricing structure that moved money to various military figures using the offset program. What they did was they actually formally submitted it as part of their bid. They said in their bid, we are going to be using IDS Infotech Mauritius to be doing this economic investment. And it was clear as day, and still it was a really good means of getting funds across. BAE Systems in South Africa, something that we've investigated, what happened there was that they announced that they were going to invest in a prepayment meter program called Conlog. Shortly thereafter, it turned out that the Minister of Defence and a couple of his cronies had been given shares in the company, had bought shares in the company, we're not sure where the money came from. So they were due to benefit hugely from those contracts. The procurement process itself, obviously there's key things we always look for. This happens a lot in the defense sector. Single bid tenders are always a red flag. Rewriting and restructuring bid specifications happens constantly and continuously. So to give you a good example, in the India case, what happened there was that there are numerous parts of India that you can't reach unless your helicopter can fly more than 6 kilometers high. So what was logical was that the head of the Air Force, who was then alleged later to have received money, decided to rewrite the bid specification and said, actually, it only has to be 4.5 kilometers high. So that allowed a particular supplier, Finmeccanica, to submit a bid and eventually win, even though they can't actually fly to about 25% of the country, have to use older helicopters. Then obviously, direct intervention on the part of political players, if you hear about that, that's obviously quite a big warning sign. Now, this is probably what this is it used to be a much longer discussion until the investigative dashboard came online. This is how we do most of our company beneficial ownership checks. I'm sure most people here know about the investigative dashboard, but if you don't, amazing tool, allows you to search company registries from around the world. One particular thing that I should highlight is it's called Dan O'Hugan's Panama Archive, which I called it there. And what he did was he scraped the entire Panamanian registry and has made it searchable. So you can search by name and you can search by company name. And that you can actually, there's a link to it on the investigative dashboard. But why I've highlighted that is because for a good period of time, especially in the 80s and the 90s, if you're looking at historical stuff, Panama was one of the key destinations through which offshore companies were formed to undertake stuff with the global arms trade. Also, I should point out the UK Companies House, they have a register of registries. If you can't find stuff on the investigative dashboard, just go there and they'll give you a list of all the different registries around the world. Big source for us is legal proceedings. Now, as Andrew may have pointed out already, the likelihood of somebody being prosecuted for corruption in the global arms trade is incredibly slim. Yet there's always little legal things you can pick up from different jurisdictions, usually around applications for bail, applications for arrest warrants, and we do that very aggressively when we do our work. The one I want to highlight for people who do work on the US arms trade and the US trade around the world is their online court system called PACER. Unfortunately, it is a paid-for service. I think you pay, it's fractions of a US cent per page that you access, but it's a phenomenal resource. Because not only do they put up judgments, they put up all the filings in a legal case. It'll be transcripts of proceedings, it'll be all the evidence that's presented, and you can get amazing, unbelievable stories out of that. I mean, there was a case that we were investigating involving an arms dealer in Iraq, where he eventually was killed in very suspicious circumstances, and his family sued in the US courts for payment. And attached to that application was just rafts and rafts of the most amazing material, showing a high level of corruption in Iraq involving some senior US officials. For Sub-Saharan Africa, SAFLI is great. I don't know if people have used it before, but it puts up all the court judgments from the High Court and upwards for Malawi, Zambia, South Africa, Mozambique. Obviously, then there's legal journals. But what I should also point out is that almost every single country that I've investigated will have some sort of court portal if you are willing to explore their Department of Justice website. I found out, for example, that in India, when we were investigating the Fin Mechanica case, that literally every single court judgment in the country is made available about 2 months after it's delivered. That's on any potential topic at a site called India Canoon, which is run by the Department of Justice. And it's become the most amazing resource. Just type in a name and you just get the most amazing information. So again, you'll probably know most of this stuff, but I want to highlight the last point, which is defense hardware specialists. A huge difficulty we have when we investigate this stuff is that you are dealing with sometimes very technical material, and you get involved in these horrible long debates with military officials and various military wonks who point out the specific caliber of a gun or the specific lift profile vector of an airplane, and you can't really compete with that. You can't discuss it. You can't penetrate it. I don't really care about weapons. I'm not one of those people that sees a weapon and gets interested. I'm interested in the corruption that happens around it, the human rights impacts. So whenever we come across that, we always go to a hardware specialist. We always go to somebody who knows how weapons work to help us. And the one source that we use almost very regularly is an amazing organization called Omega, based in the UK, it's Manchester, is that right? Yeah, in Manchester. Yeah. And they have been keeping an archive of the formal trade for decades. What they're very good at doing is helping you identify material. So if you get a photo of something, you don't know what it is, they will tell you what it is. If you see a submarine that's in waters it shouldn't be in, they'll tell you what submarine it is, potentially who it belongs to. Right. Most of you will know most of the stuff, but I'd like to point out something that 2 minutes, okay. Very quickly, the one thing that we always advise people when they're investigating corruption, that they never do, find out who the losers are. They will always talk, or almost always talk. People who have lost a contract, people who have been screwed by bribery, haven't paid enough of their own bribery. Often they will talk to you. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten really useful procurement information from losers because they're part of the procurement process. They can tell you how things have been bungled. So we had a case of a US ambassador in the States, in South Africa, who was part of a big bid that they lost, and he gave me all the dirty details, which I was able to publish. Just want to emphasize, when you find and approach arms dealers, Facebook is a great source. LinkedIn has turned into a really great source for that stuff. There was a presentation yesterday about how to get free access to LinkedIn for a year, which has become really useful for finding people. When you do approach them, again, security protocols and flattery. Flattery will get you everywhere when it comes to arms dealers, because you don't really have much to offer them. Unless you want to do a deal with them, which you wouldn't advise, because these are very dangerous people who are going to lie to you and cheat you anyway. So we always approach with a very humble approach. Andrew flatters them. I pretend like I don't know anything. Usually that gets them to talk. Finally, very quickly, on arms trafficking, I know a lot of people here have been trying to track various arms flows around the world. Again, to emphasize Omega for identifying stuff, PRIO and UN Compre databases for just aggregate data. But two things I really want to point out very quickly. Some of you may know about a website called Bellingcat, run by a guy called Elliot Higgins. What's great about that website is they've now started putting up tutorials about how to track how to verify information you get from conflict zones. So they have a guide, for example, if you get a photo of a piece of tear gas equipment in Syria, they have very interesting methods for using online tools to verify that it is actually in Syria, is on the street, did happen at this time, so I'd advise you go there. And last punt would be Riot ID, which is an organization that we've started working with, and what they focus on is identifying non-lethal tear gas around the world. They have a Twitter handle, you can find them, and they will help you identify particular items of non-lethal weapons. They also have a really useful little hand guide, so if you come across tear gas when you're in the field, it tells you how to photograph that tear gas the best way possible, so you get all the information you need so it can be identified. It's a great little tool. I recommend people use it. Finally, some links and contacts. I know I've had to go through this very quickly, so if you have any questions want to talk about particular stories, you can approach me and Andrew afterwards or find us online.
While we are making the shift, there is time for 2 questions for Andrew and Paul now, and then you can also ask them questions after Kristoffer's presentation. Are there 2 questions now? This is being streamed, so I'm coming with the microphone, please.
Thank you. You mentioned that we need to approach the arms dealers, and we know they are working on a high staff thing that probably will be hurt in a way or another. So can you please tell us, explain how to approach them, and what do we need from them by approaching them?
I mean, we're not saying to you you have to, but in certain transactions, it's very useful to approach intermediaries. And arms dealers, arms brokers, arms agents all play different roles in a contract. Often they'll have information about a contract that you're not going to find in documentary evidence. They'll know about financial flows of bribes. They'll know about the corruption involved in offset programs and how a deal was put together. So they can be very useful for that. In terms of how to approach them, it really varies. I mean, we can talk in more detail afterwards, but it would depend on the individual arms dealer. It would depend where they are based. But in general terms, we do try and develop a relationship with them. And that can sometimes take an extremely long period of time. What does sometimes surprise us is even after the book came out, where we spoke in not so flattering terms about a number of arms dealers that we have contact with, some named, some not named, they continue to remain in contact with us. So there are those who actually like talking about what they do and they don't have much opportunity to, and there are even those who like some publicity in some occasions. But there are various security protocols that are very important that we could talk about afterwards.
Hello, my name is Michael. I'm from the Network for Reporting on Eastern Europe, and you mentioned Omega before. Could you just very shortly explain what kind of type they are? Are they NGO or are they specialists?
Yeah. Omega is an NGO that was created in the UK in, I think, the 1980s, and it has been running consistently ever since then. And they identify different types of weaponry. They have this archive that goes back decades and decades, and as a consequence of which, if you send them photographs or other visual representations of weaponry, they can often identify where that weapon was produced, so you can start looking into, well, how did it get from where it was produced to where it was eventually found. They tend, again, to be very collaborative. They don't publish in their own name. They do work with some other larger NGOs and some media groups, but they're very open to assisting people with requests that come unsolicited. So if you'd like to make contact with them, please email one of us and we can put you in touch with the relevant person for your region at Omega. Yeah.
Sure. Now, Kristoffer will take you through a fantastic exposure done alone and with very few others to cooperate with in his newspaper. Be amazed.
Thank you. You can hear me? Okay, the Nigeria boat. Going to start off to tell you shortly about how, what this story is about. So you can understand, I obviously not all of you read Norwegian newspapers and follow Norwegian news. And I'm going to tell you a bit about how I uncovered this story. This story is about Norwegian military vessels, Navy vessels like this one. These are missile torpedo boats. They were built in the 70s and were upgraded in 2008 to last to 2022 or something like that. But then the Norwegian Navy found out we're not going to use them anymore and we're going to sell them. They couldn't find any Western country to sell them to because they tend to build their own and buy new vessels. So who wants to buy these vessels? So basically these vessels ended up in Nigeria for the warlord named Government Tompolo Ekpemipolo, hard name for me to pronounce. He's the former Men guerrilla commander, and he owns a security company who is now doing pirate hunting and tax claims for the Nigerian naval authorities. Also, you have this boat who was sold to the same man. This is when it arrived in Lagos just before Christmas. We sold this boat to another security company, paramilitary company in Nigeria. And these two boats, patrol boats, were sold to Cameroon to another security company. And several other vessels have ended up in paramilitary companies all around the world. Now, since I started this case for about 1.5 years ago, it has evolved. So, well, this is just a picture to show you what these paramilitaries in Nigeria had before they got the Norwegian vessels. So they have a vast advancement in military equipment down there. These are not old boats. These are very capable military vessels which has been sold. Well, as I told you, this story has gone on. We have also a lot of Norwegian military trucks who had ended up in Eritrea. Not a very nice country to sell military trucks. Also, the latest disclosure we had is these tracked troop carriers. It's a very popular troop carrier built in Sweden, which is made for the Norwegian and Swedish military, which also was sold a batch to Sudan during the Darfur conflict. So it's not a very pleasant history for old Norwegian military equipment. Anyway, how did this story start? Well, it starts with being curious. And this is basic journalism. You don't have to be an expert in arms trade, and you don't have to have vast resources. And I hope this can be an inspiration that anybody really can make big findings, big disclosures, using creativity, not being afraid to be only one person. You don't need a big team. You need the internet, you need a computer, and a little bit of knowledge about what you're trying to find. It started with me wanting to find out who bought this big boat I showed you, because this had been for sale for several years. They hadn't managed to sell it. It became a huge scandal in 2011 because they sold it to a Norwegian company who was contracted by the Somali government to do fishery patrol outside Somalia. This was then a big scandal. The foreign minister went in and said, no, we cannot sell old military equipment which is going to be used by paramilitaries other places in conflict zones, other places in the world, obviously. This is a very strict European export rule. You cannot sell to paramilitary companies which might arm these and use them in conflicts. So eventually they managed to sell this boat, and I got this document from the Norwegian government, from the Norwegian Ministry of Defence. It's an orientation letter, a note to the Ministry of Defence from the sales department in the army, telling them that we have finally sold this boat. There was this controversy in 2011, blah, blah, blah. But now we finally managed to sell it for so-and-so about $5 million, $10 million, to the British company CAS Global. And that's all. That's it. That's what it says. So I wondered, I never heard about CAS Global. Who is CAS Global? I wanted to know who bought this boat. It was a fairly famous boat in Norway because in the 80s the old royal ship, yacht burned, and then King Olav, famous Norwegian king, he used this big boat as his vessel for a year. So he had a big bathtub inside it. It's famous. Also, the Crown Prince of Norway did his military service on board this ship. So obviously I wanted to know, where did this ship end up? I didn't know that this was a big story. I just want to make, who bought it. CAS Global, that's the first thing you do. You obviously Google CAS Global. So this is CAS Global. It turns up on the web, you Google it. They have a nice web page. They tell us it's a risk management company with an international reach, and it goes on and on and on, but never really tells you what they do. There's no names. There's a lot of CAS business principle statements about blah, 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 big words, etc., but it doesn't say anything. And this is where you have to be curious, you have to be analytic when you start working on these things. You can see they have offices all over the world. London, Lagos, Delhi, Washington DC, and strangely enough, it's 12 o'clock all over the world as well. And if you click here, nothing works. Strange. And you start, here, recent news, not much. Latest news, not much. Okay, recent news, what is that? A CAS blog from 2009. And you go to who is, and you find out that this web page was founded in 2009. Actually, nothing has happened here. And you go up here, contact us. Okay, there's no names, no pictures, no CEOs, no profile. And we sold these guys Navy vessels? That's very strange. So we go, there's an address here. So obviously, again, Google, thank God. Go to Google Maps. You put in the address, and you found out that this multinational risk company has their office here, on this field. It's a camping field. I actually went there. This is a BMX track. Here they have car boot sales every Saturday. In here they have a javelin course or something, and this is for agility for dogs in this area. So this is the multinational risk management company with offices all over the world who's bought 7 huge Navy vessels from Norway. How could that be? This is really strange. So you have to find out more. You do your analysis. You go back to the website. You find out, okay, do they exist? You start Google. You find nothing. You find no persons, etc., and you start scrapping. You start taking every piece of detail. You put it in the document so you can search and you can, cross-search later on. You never know when a number, an email, a name, or one tiny detail can be very important later on. I hope to get to that. But anyway, on this website, they had a company profile and they stated partners. And most of these partners were just, companies also made by this company. But far down here, this is where experience comes. I found SKUP. SKUP. I did some work about paramilitary companies in Iraq in 2005. And I went through all these, mercenary companies, and SKUP was one of these. It was run by the most famous Foreign Legion mercenary from France, Pierre Massali. He was shot and killed in Benghazi during the Libyan war in 2011. And this famous company, which was this mercenary company, went underground. It just disappeared. So obviously, I had no one to call to tell them that, to hear if this British company, CAS Global, actually was a partner of this bad mercenary company in France. And if I went to the SKUP's website, it is now occupied by a bit sleazy Japanese massage studio. There's a lot of, if you translate this or read Japanese, it's kind of erotic. Anyway, so it was pretty hard to find out. But then we have the internet Wayback Machine. I hope everybody uses the Wayback Machine because it's great to find the old press statements, or when government has fixed the wording somewhere, you can go back in time and see the internet exactly as it was at that time. So if I go back to 2010 and, for example, July 26, obviously I went through a lot of sites, I find SKUP's original site when it was a mercenary company. And what do you know? They state that CAS Global is a partner providing them boats for paramilitary mercenary operations in Africa. So now, obviously, I have a story. We have sold military vessels to a company in Britain who has not even a post box on a field in Surrey, who provides mercenaries with boats in Africa. This is clearly nothing which the Norwegian military or the Norwegian government could, benefit from. I call the sales office in the Norwegian military who's been doing the sale, and I meet an officer. He's now under investigation for corruption, but at that time he didn't want to tell me first. He was, I can't tell you who I sold these boats to, it's a commercial secrecy, etc., etc. Oh, I got this document. It tells from the government. It says you sold it to CAS Global. Oh, so they gave you that information. Well, yeah, well, it's a multinational offshore business. They have boats all over the world. And I knew he was lying. So I just had to go on to find out where did these boats end up. I knew who bought them, but they were obviously not in a field in Surrey. So I had to find out where they ended up. And that's when we go to the second part of this story, and that's tracking boats. First, as I said, you have to track the company, all the persons. You go you go to company check, company's house, LinkedIn. All countries has these national websites. In this case, in Britain, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Flickr. Everything you search, and you take every little bit of information and you put it in a document or whatever on Google Drive or on your own drive, anywhere where you can make it searchable. You never know when something important turns up. The point is that in this search, it was very little to find out about this CAS Global. The person behind it, 60 years something, British national, and his family was basically who was running these companies. He had several. He had like 10 or 15 companies. It was this camping area. They were doing archery rental, the BMX bike rental. They were having flower shop. They had car rental, and they had this CAS Global doing risk management and whatever. And it was his wife was sitting in the board of directors, etc. So you could obviously see that this is just front companies, a lot of front companies for whatever. And if you go to company's house, you can buy, it costs £1 or £2 to get the company statements. Yeah? Yeah, I know. No, I saw it. It's just changed, right? Yeah. And there you can see that this company who bought military ships for about $10 million have a stock value of £100 or something. Obviously, these are not the buyers of these boats. Another thing I noted is that they had very little information about these people. None of these people were on Facebook, or they had some dodgy LinkedIn profiles, etc. But what it tells me is that nobody really knows about CAS Global. It's not a big multinational thing. It's very few people have ever stated working for them on LinkedIn. And if one thing is that paramilitaries, former military, etc., everyone has a LinkedIn profile, and everybody brags, or a lot of them brags from this, kind of amateur area. They brag about who they worked for. So nobody bragging about working for this company tells you something as well. No information is also information. Anyway, This is the only picture I had. This is when one of these boats left Norway. And I want you to see the colors, because obviously they couldn't sell them as military ships. No country wanted them, so they took out the guns. They repainted them blue and white to make them look more civilian. That's what they told me. And then they sold them, but they are still very capable weapon platforms. They are still very military vessels. And this is when they left from Norway. So how to find ships? I called an expert, because I'm not an expert on finding ships. I called an expert in the Norwegian Veritas, who certifies ships all over the world, just to get some input. And that's what we should do when there's a theme we don't know. Just call someone who knows, and you can learn a lot of things. They told me that most ships have the IMO. That's the International Maritime Organization number. All big ships has to be registered. It's like the chassis number on your car. It follows the car regardless of which owner, and so you can trace it. But the problem is that Norway has sold military ships, and guess what? Military ships are not required to have the IMO number. So actually we have sold grey market ships, because Norway, most of these ships were never classified as civilian before they sold them, because that costs money. They just sold them, grey market ships, which is pretty bad in itself. But also one thing, to make these ships attractive to sell, they also equipped them with the state-of-the-art latest civilian communication system, radars, radio equipment, etc., because the military equipment was taken out. But in order to sell them to get a good price, they put new civilian equipment inside. And that has AIS, it's automatic identification system. Most boats has that today, modern boats. It's a tracking device to tell, you know, anti-collision actually is what it is. It sends out a radio beacon on every boat when it's running to tell them where it is, what's its name, what's its radio call sign, and where is it heading. Also, they have the MMSI, which is a kind of, when you hear on the radio, that's the MMSI going out. It's a signal telling you which call sign, who's the owner, etc. All these things have registrations, which pops up in places like this, marinetraffic.com, and all other like boat spotting sites. Because whenever you register a boat, a lot of information comes. And using this system, I have to go through, but using this system, I managed to track these boats. I found the numbers, found their beacons, and suddenly several of these, 3 of these 6 boats had a beacon in Lagos. In Lagos, you can go on Google Map again, and at this time you could find the satellite image where the beacon was going off, and if you see these boats, these are 4 of the 6 patrol boats which I was trying to track down in the world. They were giving their beacons from Lagos. The last thing, 1 minute, 2 minutes? 1 minute. Yeah. So how to find them? Because now I know they are in Lagos, but they're obviously not sold to Pierre Massali because he's dead. CAS Global is impossible to get. They don't even have a mailbox. So where are these boats? I tried to call down and get someone in Nigeria, in Lagos, to take this picture, but it's a very restricted area in these ports of Lagos. And even the local photographers said, no, that's dangerous. I cannot take pictures there. Again, short story, Google picture search. Patrol boat Lagos. Military boat Lagos. Whatever boat Lagos. And there's like 4,000 boats in Lagos. And you go through and you find nothing. And you have a lot of ways to restrict your search, and you can search on colors. I tried to search on color blue because you saw the blue boats. Damn. Search a boat in blue, you will get a lot of sea. Anyway, but if you see in the corner, you see a small blue boat. I found a lot of small blue boats with white top saying Nimasa. That's the Nigerian Maritime Administration and Safety Agency. So that's how I found the boats, because on that website they had a photo carousel with a big event where President Goodluck Jonathan has his baptizing the new gunboats for NIMASA, which is a partnership between NIMASA and a company named Global West Vessel Specialists, which is a security company who's bought these boats and is running this anti-piracy fleet, privately anti-piracy fleet, is owned by no other than the warlord government Tomplo Ekpemipolo. So that concludes how I found the ships, solely using one computer, basically this computer, internet, and using a few hours now and then doing all the other stuff you have to do being a reporter in a big daily newspaper. So there's a lot more to this story. I can talk to you at in the bar later on, but this is basically how you track down arms around the world using the internet. Thank you.
The bar afterwards with more questions, but we have time for a few last questions, and since this is being streamed, I'm coming to you with a microphone if you have questions for Kristoffer or our two South African guests. And please introduce yourselves.
Okay, I'm Joshua from Premium Times Nigeria. Fascinating job you did, Kristoffer. Were you able to make any contact with Tompolo? Of course, he likes to brag too. Were you able to talk to him? Was he able to tell you how he got the funding? And was he related to oil and all of the stuff that he does?
That's a good question. Yeah, initially I tried a lot of time to get in contact to Tompolo. I used emails, I tried to call, I called his associates and stuff. Initially, everything went, you know, I hit the brick wall every time. And this story was, you know, very unknown in Nigeria all the way until this big vessel I showed you, which arrived just before Christmas last year. Then I think it was Vanguard or some Nigerian newspaper picked up the story, and then it exploded in Nigeria. It was all over at least the web news. And at that time, Tompolo was attacked, having brought these boats, etc., etc. It got even harder to reach him and get a comment. But he's been commenting this in Nigeria after, you know, being confronted with it by Nigerian news organizations.
Any other final questions?
Thank you. Thank you all for your presentations. Very interesting. I'm Eva Simala from Finland, and I'd like to ask Kjell about the fact that, well, when you wrote your stories, did they pass through a legal expert before they were published?
No, not a legal expert, but obviously this is stories which has been run through the editorial staff, and we're quite close. We have a pretty flat organization in our news division, which means that all the leaders and all the reporters, they speak on a daily basis. They have they work together, very knitted. So obviously we had a good screening, went through, you know, line by line, confirmation, etc.
I think there is a point just very quickly on that. I think if you're doing a sort of a longer piece on this sort of thing, it is quite useful to get some legal advice and to make sure that you source a lot of your information. Even though quite a lot of our sources are human sources, we still, for instance, in the book, we have over 2,800 footnotes. So whenever we say a particular arms dealer went to the bathroom on a particular day at a particular time, we then list that we spoke to two people who saw him go in and come out or were standing next to him or whatever.
2 more questions now. 3 more, and then we draw the line.
Hi, we have a technical questions down here. How did you, what is unclear is like, how did you track the ships without the IMO number when you found them on a satellite image in Lagos? It's unclear that passage, if you can explain it like step by step.
We made a program because there's actually companies taking care of all the IES data all over the world, and they keep it in a big database. So we found a company in Canada who's stored it. So when I got the number, the IES number of the boat, when I finally found the IES number, we can send it to this company and get the data for the last couple of years. Oh, I'll tell you afterwards. It's quite easy actually, but you have to work for it. Take care of, you have to, store all the things, and you have to find the system. They sold this brand new equipment. So I found one radio set with one number, and I figured maybe they bought a whole set of radio equipment from the same place, so the numbers would be in the series. And then by tracking the numbers in series, suddenly I found 3 numbers in this pattern who was beaconing in Lagos.
Just also, yeah.
I wanted to know how did the Nigerians use the British company to do the bid? I mean, why did they know to go to this particular company? CAS Global.
Well, these guys can probably tell more about how this works. I mean, there's so many security companies around there. A lot of them in Britain. Britain is a big industry with former soldiers, former security advisors, etc., having all these companies doing these trades, and they have a seaman tradition. So boats in Britain is pretty common. Also, you see in my story, there's clear South African links all the way to like executive outcomes, former executive outcomes people, a lot of Africa business, Paramount Group, which you guys know, etc. So these are kind of a connected shell companies, all based all over Africa, and with a lot of footprints and fingerprints in Britain doing European sales and security contracts all over the world.
Final question now, and then you can have a final remark afterwards, Andrew, and then we have to close because other people are using the room afterwards.
Brief one. John Grimonprez, freelance journalist, Namibia. How much does the offshore feature in this transaction?
I didn't.
How much? Hello.
How much did the offshore taxpayers, do they feature at all in the transaction? Did they make use of offshore jurisdictions?
Offshore financial.
Yeah. How was the paperwork?
That's a big. I don't have time for that today. But that's a big dimension of this story, is how they invited, actually Norwegian Foreign Office invited Nigerian bankers to come and look at the boats before they financed it. So all the money for these boats have been routed through African banks, Nigerian banks basically, offshore accounts, and directly to the Norwegian military surplus sales office. And that's where the corruption charge, which is now running, 2 Brits and 1 Norwegian officer is currently under investigation for corruption because there's been money transferred between them also.
One remark from Andrew.
2 other very quick pieces of information. One in terms of why is the UK used. One, because as Eva Jolie once described it, it's the money laundering capital of the world. So you can do all sorts of things financially through the City of London. 2, it's incredibly easy to register a front company. There's no scrutiny. There is very little legal recourse. There is virtually no political or prosecutorial will to ever prosecute corporate malfeasance in the UK. So all of those things make it a very good destination. And then finally, just on the transport thing and the ships, CIPRI do actually have a small unit that tries to track primarily air transport, but also some sea transport. And we could put you in touch with a person who runs that if you're particularly interested in that dimension of a case.
Yeah, and finally, of course, most important, because to sell these kind of military surplus equipment, this is a big point. To sell it from Norway to the UK, there's almost no custom scrutiny, because they feel, we are selling it to within the EU, so it's not our problem. We don't have to be so strict on who it goes to, because the EU will be responsible for any further exporter to conflict zones. So it's kind of cleaning the sheet, it's not our responsibility. We sold it to UK. They really didn't. These boats, most of them were never inside UK. They went directly to Nigeria or to Africa, West Africa. But since it's a British company who's on paper bought them, the Norwegian Foreign Office and the Norwegian Export Control did really basically nothing. As you see, they didn't even Google the company and find out that they're on a field in Surrey and not a multinational country. They didn't even use Google to do the export control.
Thank you so much. All the three of them deserve a good hand.